It was a hot summer afternoon in a small, suburban town, where the air was thick with humidity and tension. The kind of tension that people pretend not to feel but is always there, lurking beneath the surface. In this town, most people knew each other, and if they didn't, they certainly knew of each other. But even here, where gossip traveled fast, secrets could sometimes go unnoticed, like the one Officer Ray Thompson would soon stumble upon. Officer Thompson had been with the local police force for nearly a decade. He wasn't a bad man, at least not in his own eyes. He believed in law and order, in keeping the peace, but he also had biases that he didn't fully recognize. Deep down, he had a distrust of anyone who didn't look or live like him, though he would never say that aloud. It was on this fateful afternoon that Officer Thompson received a call about a disturbance at the park downtown. The dispatcher had been vague. Something about a group of teens being rowdy near the swings. As he pulled up to the park, he spotted a group of black teenagers huddled around a girl sitting on the ground. They were laughing and talking, but to him it looked suspicious. Without a second thought, he got out of his patrol car, hand already resting on the holster of his gun, and approached them. "All right, what's going on here?" Thompson demanded, his voice sharp. The teenagers looked up, surprised but not alarmed. A tall boy in the group, wearing a worn-out basketball jersey, spoke first. "We're just hanging out, officer. Nothing's going on." Thompson's eyes darted to the girl on the ground. She was petite, with long braids and sitting in a wheelchair. Her smile faltered when she noticed the officer's tense expression. "Is she okay?" Thompson asked, pointing toward the girl, his tone accusatory. "Yeah, she's fine," the boy replied quickly, stepping in front of the officer. "That's my sister, Mariah. We're just chillin', man." Thompson wasn't convinced. His eyes narrowed as he looked at Mariah. Something about her wheelchair, about the way she sat there, made him uneasy. He was used to looking for signs of trouble, and in that moment he decided these kids were it. "Step aside," Thompson barked, moving toward Mariah. The boy hesitated, glancing nervously at his friends. "We didn't do anything wrong, officer," I said. "Step aside," Thompson repeated, his hand now gripping the butt of his gun. Before anyone could react, Thompson reached down and grabbed the handles of Mariah's wheelchair, pulling her forward roughly to check if she was hurt or if something more sinister was going on. In the process, Mariah's foot slipped off the footrest, and she let out a yelp of pain. "Hey!" Mariah's brother shouted, lunging toward the officer. "What the hell are you doing?" Thompson shoved him back hard. "Back off." Mariah's brother stumbled but didn't fall. His friends, frozen in shock, watched in disbelief. Mariah winced, trying to adjust herself in the chair. The situation had escalated too quickly, and now Thompson was standing between them, one hand on his gun, the other on Mariah's wheelchair. In that tense moment, Mariah's phone, which had been resting in her lap, buzzed. She glanced down at the screen and her heart skipped a beat. It was her father, Agent Mark Johnson of the FBI, texting to check on her as he always did. Without saying a word, Mariah hit the call button on her phone and placed it on speaker. "Hey, Dad," she said, her voice shaking a little. "I'm at the park, and there's a problem." The kids around her could hear the worry in her voice, and so could Officer Thompson, but he didn't step back. On the other end of the line, Agent Mark Johnson's voice was calm but alert. "What's going on, sweetheart?" Thompson felt a chill run down his spine. The name sounded familiar. "Who are you calling?" Mariah didn't answer him directly. She kept talking to her father. "Dad, a police officer is here, and he's not letting us go." There was a pause on the other end. Then Mark Johnson's voice returned, but this time it was firm, authoritative. "Put the officer on the phone, Mariah." Thompson's face turned pale as he realized what was happening, but he still didn't move. Instead, he reached for the phone himself, trying to keep control of the situation. Mariah held it out, her hand shaking slightly. "This is Officer Ray Thompson," he said, his voice not nearly as confident as before. The voice on the other end was icy cold. "Officer Thompson, this is Special Agent Mark Johnson, FBI. You are currently manhandling my daughter, and I strongly suggest you remove your hands from her chair immediately." Thompson's grip on the wheelchair loosened, and he stepped back, his mind racing. FBI? How could this black girl, be connected to someone that high up in law enforcement? It didn't make sense to him. His heart pounded as he tried to come up with an explanation for what he had just done. "Agent Johnson, I didn't realize," Thompson stammered. "You didn't realize what?" Agent Johnson interrupted, his voice sharp. "That she's disabled? That she's a human being? Or that she's my daughter?" Thompson's mouth went dry. He looked around at the group of teenagers, all of whom were now glaring at him with a mixture of fear and anger. He suddenly realized how it must have looked. A white police officer roughing up a disabled black girl in front of her friends. The implications were obvious, and the weight of it hit him like a ton of bricks. "I didn't mean to hurt her," Thompson said, his voice barely above a whisper. I thought something was wrong." "You thought wrong," Agent Johnson shot back. "I'm on my way there now. You stay right where you are." Thompson didn't know what to do. He looked down at Mariah, who was now being comforted by her brother. She wasn't crying, but her face was tense, and she looked exhausted. Like this wasn't the first time something like this had happened to her. In the minutes that followed, Thompson stood frozen, the weight of his actions sinking in. He had acted out of suspicion, out of bias, and now it had blown up in his face. But as the minutes ticked by, he also felt something else: regret. When Agent Johnson arrived, he stepped out of his black SUV in full FBI gear. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and wore the kind of expression that made people take a step back. Thompson watched as he walked straight toward Mariah, kneeling down beside her to check if she was okay. She nodded silently, and he stood up, turning to face Thompson. "What were you thinking?" Agent Johnson asked quietly, but there was anger behind his eyes. Thompson swallowed hard, unsure of how to respond. I thought they were causing trouble." "You thought they were causing trouble," Agent Johnson repeated, the weight of his words sinking in. "And by they, you mean black kids hanging out at a park?" Thompson opened his mouth to protest but couldn't find the words. Everything sounded wrong now. There was no excuse, not really. He had seen what he wanted to see. A group of black kids, one of them disabled, and assumed the worst. He hadn't given them a chance, hadn't even asked what was going on before he escalated the situation. Mark Johnson took a deep breath, trying to calm himself. "Officer Thompson, I don't care what you thought. You need to understand that you can't go around treating people like this, especially my daughter or any child for that matter." Thompson nodded slowly, shame washing over him. He couldn't look any of them in the eye. Agent Johnson stepped closer, his voice low but firm. "You need to re-examine how you approach situations like this. Because today it was my daughter. Tomorrow it could be someone else's. And the next time you might not be so lucky." Thompson looked up at the agent, finally meeting his gaze. There was no hatred there, just disappointment. And somehow that felt worse. As Agent Johnson led Mariah and the rest of the group back to his car, Thompson was left standing alone in the park, the sun beating down on him. He knew this was a moment he would never forget, a moment that would haunt him. He had to confront his own prejudices and biases, those invisible chains that had influenced his actions for so long. He realized that being a good officer wasn't just about enforcing the law. It was about seeing people, really seeing them beyond their color, their disability, their differences. And for the first time in his life, Thompson understood that the biggest changes had to start within himself. As the park emptied out and the heat of the day began to wane, Officer Thompson stood there in silence, knowing that this was only the beginning of the lessons he had to learn. The echoes of Mark Johnson's words reverberated in Officer Thompson's mind as he stood frozen in place. The warmth of the setting sun was no longer comforting. It felt like a glaring spotlight exposing his mistakes, laying them bare for all to see. He climbed back into his patrol car, his hands trembling slightly as he gripped the steering wheel. He didn't drive off right away. Instead, he sat there, staring out of the windshield at the now empty park, replaying the scene over and over in his head. Each moment felt more humiliating than the last. For years, Thompson had believed that he was just doing his job, keeping order, protecting people, upholding the law. But now, for the first time, he wondered if he had been protecting everyone or just certain people. The realization was unsettling. He had convinced himself that he was fair, that he didn't let race or circumstance affect his judgment. But today's events had shown him otherwise. The truth was undeniable, and it burned. He glanced at the clock on the dashboard. His shift was ending soon, but going home didn't feel right. Not now. Not yet. Instead, he pulled out his phone and scrolled through his contacts until he found the number he was looking for. Chief of Police, Dale Mason. The chief had always been a mentor to Thompson, a man who believed in law and order but had a more nuanced understanding of community dynamics. If anyone could help him make sense of what had just happened, it would be Chief Mason. After a moment's hesitation, Thompson pressed call. Thompson, came the gruff voice on the other end. What's up, Chief? Thompson paused, unsure of how to start. I messed up today. Big time. There was a beat of silence before Chief Mason spoke again, his tone softer now. What happened? Thompson explained everything. How he had responded to the park call, how he had approached the group of teens, and most importantly, how he had treated Mariah. As he recounted the events, the weight of his actions pressed down on him harder. When he finished, there was a long pause on the other end. Finally, the chief let out a heavy sigh. Ray, this isn't the first time we've had this kind of talk, is it? Thompson's heart sank. He knew what the chief was referring to. There had been other complaints in the past, minor incidents that had been brushed off, excused away as misunderstandings or overreactions. But this was different. This wasn't just a misunderstanding. He had crossed a line, and there was no denying it. No, it's not, Thompson admitted quietly. You know I've always had your back. Ray, Chief Mason said, his voice carrying a mix of disappointment and concern. But this is serious. You've got to start seeing things differently, or you're not going to make it on this force much longer. Thompson swallowed hard. He knew the chief was right, but hearing it out loud, from someone he respected, made it all the more real. I know. I want to do better. Good, Mason replied, his tone still firm but less harsh. Because it's not just about you, Ray. It's about the people you're supposed to protect. And right now, a lot of them don't feel protected. They feel targeted. Thompson clenched his jaw, guilt gnawing at him. What do I do now? There was a pause. Then the chief spoke again, this time more thoughtfully. I want you to take some time to think about this, really think about it. Talk to someone. We've got that diversity training coming up. Don't just go through the motions this time. Learn from it. And if you're serious about changing, I can help you, but you've got to meet me halfway. I will, Thompson said, though he wasn't sure how. He just knew that he couldn't keep going down the path he was on. All right, the chief replied. Go home. Take a breather, and we'll talk more tomorrow. After hanging up, Thompson sat in silence for a long while, processing the conversation. He didn't know if talking to the chief had made him feel better or worse, but it had at least given him direction. He had to confront the parts of himself he had been ignoring for too long. Across town, in the safety of their home, Mariah sat in the living room with her father, still shaken but trying to settle into the comfort of familiar surroundings. The incident at the park replayed in her mind, a whirlwind of emotions she wasn't quite sure how to process. She had always known that being black and disabled put her in a unique position, one where she had to fight for both visibility and respect. But today had been a harsh reminder that, no matter who her father was or how careful she tried to be, she wasn't immune to the prejudices of others. Agent Johnson sat beside her, his face still tight with residual anger, though he was doing his best to hide it. He had been through this too many times before, not just as a father but as a black man in America. He had dealt with countless instances of discrimination, and no matter how many badges or titles he earned, he knew that some people would only ever see the color of his skin. Now, seeing his daughter go through the same thing cut deeper than he could express. Are you okay, sweetie? He asked, his voice softer than it had been earlier. Mariah nodded, though her eyes betrayed the uncertainty she felt. I'm fine, Dad. I'm just tired, you know. Johnson exhaled, leaning back in his chair. Yeah, I know. I'm tired too. They sat in silence for a moment before Mariah spoke again, her voice barely above a whisper. Do you think things will ever change? Her father's expression tightened. It was the question that had haunted him his whole life. He wanted to believe that things were getting better, that progress was being made, but moments like today made it hard to hold on to that hope. I think, he said slowly, choosing his words carefully, that things can change. But it's going to take a lot more work. From people like me, from people like you, and from people like him. Mariah frowned. Like Officer Thompson? Johnson nodded. Yeah, like him. He needs to learn. A lot of them do. And it's not going to happen overnight. But it has to start somewhere. Mariah wasn't sure she believed that Thompson could change. But she trusted her father, and if he thought it was possible, maybe, just maybe, there was hope. I don't want to be scared every time I go outside, she admitted, her voice small. Her father leaned over and gently placed a hand on her shoulder. You shouldn't have to be. And as long as I'm around, I'm going to do everything in my power to make sure you don't have to be. Mariah smiled faintly, grateful for her father's strength, even if the world outside didn't always reflect it. In the days that followed, the incident at the park became a point of discussion within the community. Some people sided with Officer Thompson, believing that he had just made an unfortunate mistake. Others, particularly those in Mariah's neighborhood, saw it as yet another example of the systemic racism that plagued law enforcement. But for Thompson, the event marked the beginning of an internal reckoning. He began attending the department's diversity training sessions, but this time he wasn't just going through the motions. He listened, really listened, to the stories of people whose experiences were different from his own. He sought out conversations with fellow officers who had a better understanding of the community, and he started to see his role differently. He realized that policing wasn't just about enforcing the law. It was about building trust, especially with those who had long felt alienated by the system. It was a slow process, one filled with uncomfortable truths and moments of doubt. But over time, Thompson began to change. He started to question his assumptions, to challenge the biases he had always taken for granted. He wasn't perfect, and he knew there would always be more to learn. But for the first time, he was willing to do the work. And as for Mariah, she continued to navigate the world with the strength and resilience she had inherited from her father. She knew that there would be more challenges ahead, but she also knew that change, however slow, was possible. And in that, there was a glimmer of hope. Months passed since the incident at the park, and though life seemed to return to normal in the small town, the effects of that summer day rippled beneath the surface. For Officer Ray Thompson, the experience was a wake-up call, but change didn't happen overnight. It was a journey, one that required him to confront the things he had ignored about himself for too long. In the weeks following the confrontation with Mariah and Agent Johnson, Thompson kept to himself more than usual. He didn't hang around the station as much after his shifts, and he avoided conversations about the incident with his colleagues. Some of the officers shrugged it off as bad luck, just one of those bad days that every cop has. Others, though, started to watch Thompson more closely, curious if the man they thought they knew would be the same after this. He wasn't. One afternoon, Thompson found himself sitting in the police station's break room, staring at the bottom of his coffee mug, lost in thought. His mind kept drifting back to Mariah, to the look of fear on her face, and to the weight of Agent Johnson's words. They had stung, but they were true. The department's diversity training had been eye-opening in ways he hadn't expected. He heard stories from his fellow officers, Black and Hispanic cops, about growing up in neighborhoods where they were constantly treated with suspicion. He started to realize that policing wasn't just about enforcing the law. It was about understanding the people you were protecting. And then there were the stories from the community, people who shared how their interactions with the police made them feel small, powerless. Thompson had always prided himself on being fair, on not letting personal feelings get in the way of his duty. But those stories showed him that it wasn't enough to just follow the rules. He had to understand why those rules sometimes felt like chains to the people he was supposed to protect. One day, after a particularly intense training session, Thompson decided he needed to do something he had been avoiding. He picked up his phone and dialed Agent Johnson's number. The line rang a few times before the familiar voice answered. Agent Johnson speaking. Agent Johnson. It's Ray Thompson, Thompson began, his voice shaky. I was hoping we could talk. There was a pause on the other end, followed by a cautious, all right. What's this about, officer? I wanted to apologize, Thompson said, the words catching in his throat, for what happened at the park that day. I've had some time to think, and I was wrong. I didn't see Mariah for who she was. I just saw what I wanted to see, and that's not how I should be doing this job. Another pause. This one felt longer, heavier. I appreciate that, Agent Johnson finally replied, his voice calm but guarded. But you've got to understand, it's not just about saying sorry. It's about what you do next. I know, Thompson said quickly. I'm trying to do better. I've been going through the training, and it's opened my eyes to a lot of things I didn't want to see before. But I wanted you to know that I'm serious about changing. Johnson's voice softened just slightly. Good. Because this isn't just about Mariah. It's about all the people out there who feel like they don't matter to people like you. People with a badge. You've got a responsibility, Officer Thompson. You've got the power to either protect or harm, and the choices you make don't just affect you. They affect all of us. Thompson nodded, even though Johnson couldn't see him. I understand that now. There was another pause. Then Johnson spoke again, his tone more thoughtful. Look, if you're serious about this, maybe there's something you can do. My daughter's school is holding a community forum next week about law enforcement and trust. They're inviting local officers to come and speak. It might be a good place for you to listen, to hear from the community. Thompson felt a knot tighten in his stomach at the thought of standing in front of a room full of people who probably didn't trust him. But he also knew that this was part of the process. He couldn't just stay silent and hope things would blow over. He had to show up. I'll be there, Thompson said, his voice firm. The day of the forum arrived, and the auditorium at Mariah's school was packed. The tension in the air was palpable as members of the community filed in. Black, white, Hispanic, young and old. There were families, students, and elders, all gathered to have their voices heard. Thompson sat near the back, feeling out of place in his uniform. He had never felt this kind of nervousness on the job before, but tonight was different. Tonight, he wasn't in control. Mariah sat at the front with her father, and when she caught sight of Thompson, her eyes widened with surprise. She hadn't expected him to come. Johnson leaned down and whispered something to her, and she nodded, though her expression remained cautious. As the forum began, people took turns speaking, sharing their experiences, their frustrations, their fears. Some spoke about being harassed by police for no reason. Others talked about feeling invisible, as though their lives didn't matter unless something went terribly wrong. Thompson listened to each story, his heart heavy. He had heard about these things before, but sitting here in this room, surrounded by people who lived it every day, the reality hit him harder than he had anticipated. Finally, the moderator invited the officers in the room to speak. There were a few murmurs as Thompson stood up and made his way to the front. He could feel the weight of the room's collective gaze on him as he stepped up to the microphone. I'm Officer Ray Thompson, he began, his voice quieter than usual. I've been a police officer in this town for nearly 10 years, and I'd like to say a few things. He paused, searching for the right words. I made a mistake a few months ago, he said, his voice gaining strength. At the park, I acted on assumptions and bias, and I hurt someone who didn't deserve it. Her name is Mariah Johnson, and she's here tonight. I owe her, and all of you, an apology. He glanced at Mariah, who was watching him intently, her expression unreadable. I'm not proud of what I did, Thompson continued, but I'm here tonight because I want to do better. I've been learning a lot about the ways in which people of color, people from marginalized communities experience law enforcement, and I realize now that I wasn't doing my job the way I should have. I wasn't protecting everyone. The room was silent, and Thompson could feel the weight of their judgment, but he kept going. I'm committed to changing the way I approach this job, he said. It's going to take time, and I'm going to make mistakes along the way, but I want you to know that I'm listening. I'm learning, and I want to be the kind of officer that you can trust, that your kids can trust. That's my responsibility, and I take it seriously." When he finished, there was no applause, no immediate signs of approval. Just a heavy, contemplative silence. Thompson knew that it would take more than words to earn their trust, but he was prepared for that. This was just the beginning of a long process. After the forum ended, people began to file out of the auditorium, quietly discussing the night's events. As Thompson stood by the door, feeling the weight of everything that had been said, he noticed Mariah and her father walking toward him. Mariah stopped in front of him, her eyes searching his face. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then, to his surprise, she extended her hand. "Thank you," she said quietly, her voice soft but steady. Thompson hesitated, then shook her hand, feeling a surge of something he hadn't felt in a long time. "Hope." "Thank you," he replied. As Mariah and her father walked away, Thompson stood there, watching them leave. He knew that this was far from over, that there was still a long road ahead. But for the first time, he felt like he was walking in the right direction. And maybe, just maybe, things could change after all. Thank you for joining me on this journey through a powerful story of change, reflection, and the ongoing fight against prejudice. Remember, true progress comes from listening, learning, and taking action. If this story resonated with you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to my channel for more content that explores important social issues and inspires change. Stay tuned for more.